have Rob Boston with us, who is with the Americans United, and he's going to explain why Americans are united for separation of church and state.
I am a member.
Oh, excellent.
Yes.
Well,
Glad to hear that.
No, that's the thing. We as human beings need to be united. Stop with all the little bickering. Ah! Ooh, I shut up.
well, that's okay. All righty. All right. Who else do we have? We have Felice, Linda. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, everybody. And Dennis again. Hi, how are you? Glad you're with us. So what I think we should do is get the show on the road, as they say. And I always start with some remarks, some opening remarks. And I don't have a teleprompter, but I do have a cell phone, and I take my notes and put them on here. So it looks like, if you have a teleprompter, I could be looking right into the camera and reading at the same time, which is great and makes it look like I'm just speaking off the cuff, as they say. But I don't have one of those. So I'm going to just say welcome to everybody. Welcome to the First Coast Free Thought Society Zoom room. Appreciate that you are all here. The First Coast Free Thought Society is an organization of individuals who prefer science and reason over religious dogma and fanaticism. We've enjoyed the non-religious community in Northeast Florida since 1998, and we are now in our 25th year. We are also the proud Jacksonville chapter of the American Humanists Association. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Meetup, Instagram, and YouTube. We have Secular Sunday in the Park, book and movie discussion groups, and the Free Thinker newsletter, to which we invite your submissions. Our website is fcfs.org. I do have a question. I ask this every time because I'm curious and it's interesting for us to learn. If anyone here is new to the First Coast Free Thought Society tonight, is this your first time with us? And if so, are you willing to share with us how you heard of us? Show of hands if you're new. Elena, would you go ahead, Elena? Unmute yourself, and then.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually Rob's colleague. I just joined Americans United a little less than a month ago, so I'm trying to learn as much as I can, as fast as I can. So that's why I'm here.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. And how did you hear of us? Through Rob?
Through Rob, yes.
Okay, very good. I appreciate that. Anybody else care to share if you're new to the First Coast Free Thought Society?
Hi, this is Felice. I'm not new, but I have not been to a meeting since you were meeting on the Arlington Expressway a long time ago.
Oh.
So I still get the newsletters, I still follow, and I was interested in the topic, and I'm retired now, so I had time. So well, it's good to be here.
And it's good to have you, Felice. You're going back quite ways when the First Coast Free Thought Society was at the Arlington Expressway.
Long time ago.
Yeah, that's good.
But I've continued to get the newsletters and follow what you're doing, and I had time today.
Thank you. Do you read the newsletters?
I do.
Oh, well, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else care to share relative to whether you're new to us? Anybody?
Hi, I'm Janae Garrick, and I am new to you. I found out about this Zoom meeting through the Americans United newsletter. My interest lies in understanding the conversation and the nuance. I'm suing my former religious employer for gender discrimination. So I'm in a 5-year lawsuit.
Oh, wow. You have, okay, that's a fascinating story right there, I'm sure. All right. Well, thank you, Janae.
Thank you.
Derek, where are you from? Where are you sitting right now? Are you
I am in Northern California.
Like San Francisco?
Woodland, just outside of Sacramento.
Oh, it's more central. Okay, very good.
Yes, central.
Yeah, oh, very good. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Welcome to Angie. Angie just joined us. All right. Now, Wendell, I see your hand up, but we're going to get to questions in a minute. After, just hold on. Let me finish my opening remarks. Is there anybody else here new to the First Coast Free Thought Society who is willing to share how you heard about us?
I'm not new. I'm not new. I've been a member for many years, but I too have not attended a meeting since you left the Arlington location where I went regularly. But I do read the newsletters and stay in touch. And
Well, good, Bernard. I appreciate your participating with us this evening. Thank you very much. Last call. Anybody else? Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, I welcome everybody. Everybody, whether you're new or not new or whatever, I thank you all for being here. As you know, we are all volunteers, and we do incur expenses, largely promotion. We promote it online, on the radio, and in print. What's next? Billboards, sky banners? If you know of a viable place for us to promote what we are trying to accomplish here, please share it with us. We also have some associated costs for our websites and fees for regulatory compliance as a 501c3 charitable organization. So if you can see your way clear to offer a membership donation of $20 or $50 or any dollar amount, you'll be part of the reason we are able to continue our public outreach. We are tremendously grateful for all who have become members and all who have made donations. We need you and we appreciate you. Upcoming guest speakers we can look forward to include in July, Brandon Scheck from the Innocence Project. Next month, June 20, we look forward to hearing what lifelong activist and a local Shiro, Frida Saraga, has to say about her work with the Planned Parenthood Association, LGBTQ organizations, communities, and her work as the founder of the Jacksonville chapter of PFLAG, formerly known as Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays. The latter, then later in the year, we look forward to Dr. Nick Seabrook, a political science professor and public administration chair at UNF, who will discuss his book, One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. And there are others too, like Jacksonville University Professor Eric Freiberger, who is a philosophical professor over at JU. It's always fun when the philosophy professors show up. So check your local listing, sign on to Meetup, sign up for our newsletter and email announcements. You can do this on our website. Stay in touch. You can do all of this on our website. So now, tonight, we are delighted and eager to welcome Robert Boston, who will offer his views in a presentation titled Debunking the Christian Nation Myth, the Christian Nation Myth. Since 1987, Rob has worked for Americans United for Separation of Church and State and is now their senior advisor and editor of Church and State magazine. Rob is also a distinguished author of 4 books, including Why the Religious Right is Wrong About Separation of Church and State and Taking Liberties, Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. Rob has also appeared on many national television, news, radio, and podcast programs. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, AU for short. AU was also the element name for gold. So there will be plenty of time for a Q&A discussion. And should you prefer, you may message a question or comment via the Zoom chat. Let's mute the mic until it's time to speak. Mute our mics until it's time to speak. Please know we are recording the presentation for posterity. A side note, we don't know what might be said during the Q&A. This is a public forum. We invite the public. And we don't try to control, unless things get way out of hand, what's going on. We're open to the public. Sometimes we cringe and sometimes we nod in quiet approval. So now, let's enjoy the time, expertise, and insights graciously offered to us by Rob Boston from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Rob, we are all yours.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you for having me here this evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a 19th century German philosopher, greatly influenced by the ideas of Immanuel Kant. Hegel once said, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." A cynical statement, but one that appeals to me because there is some truth in that. And tonight we're going to be talking about some history. It's important. History informs us. History plays a role in where we are today. History can be instructive. All nations have an origin story. An origin story is usually a combination of things. Some myths, some facts, some aspirations, all come together to provide a story of origins. In the United States, so much of our origin story is wrapped up around the question of and the issue of religious freedom. Think about how many times you've heard people say that. Well, the Puritans and the Pilgrims came for religious freedom. Yes, they did for themselves, but not really for anybody else. And some of the people who came weren't really interested in religious freedom at all. We're really interested more in economic issues and getting a new start and making money. And as we think about this history tonight, and as we debunk the myth of the Christian nation so beloved by Christian nationalists, I want you to bear in mind that one of the sort of most interesting facets of this discussion is that the actual story that we have in this country, the real story, the truth, has many good things to say about it. We don't need a Christian nation myth because the actual story is compelling enough. It's a story of a country that had people living on it when the settlers came, and the violence that they sometimes used to overcome. So there are dark periods of this history, we know that. But a rather narrow-minded segment of settlers in one region of the country. From that, we grew to a nation of dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of faiths, as well as those who have no faith. When it comes to religious freedom, the story is in many ways a successful one that we can be proud of. Yet there are people who don't want us to tell that story. So as we begin to look at this issue, the Christian nation, the myth of America as being founded as a Christian nation, I'm going to talk about some lines of evidence. And the first one, and honestly, this should be the only line of evidence we need. This should end the debate, the discussion. And that is the text of the Constitution itself. Christian nationalists will speak very fondly of the Constitution. They tend to fetishize it. And I sometimes wonder, have they ever taken the time to read it? Because there is no evidence in that document that supports their point of view of America founded to be a Christian nation. It simply does not say that. As many of you may know, the religious freedom clauses of the First Amendment are 16 words long. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's it, 16 words. Nowhere does it say Christianity is enshrined in law, upheld for special treatment, or in any way favored. Nowhere. In fact, the Constitution, nowhere in the text of it of the document do we find the words Christ, Christianity, or God. It is a secular document. And it contains a provision at the end of Article 6 that states that there shall be no religious test for public office. Now, by religious test, the founders didn't mean like a pop quiz. They meant that there can be no religious qualification for public office. So you can hold federal office in America, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, atheist, whatever. Some states had qualifications in their constitution limiting public office to Christians or Protestants or Trinitarians or barring atheists. None of that is found in the federal Constitution. So there's clear evidence there that this document was intended to encompass all, and certainly doesn't in any way preference Christianity. And believe me, this discussion, this debate, this happened at the time of the founding. This was all discussed. There were people who would have favored official recognition of Christianity. There were people who advocated for that, and their views did not carry the day. So really, that's I think, a devastating point for the Christian nationalist, is that the Constitution in no way supports their point of view. This is why they so often point to other documents. They'll point to, for example, the deistic references to the Creator found in the Declaration of Independence, or they'll point to other documents. But those other documents, as interesting as they may be historically, are not governance documents. The Constitution is the governance document. It does not say we were founded to be a Christian nation. First line of evidence. Second line of evidence is the political beliefs of key founders. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it clear that we have to be careful not to deify our founders. They had many flaws. Many of them owned slaves. They could not have conceived of the multicultural society that we have today. Many of them could not have conceived of women playing the prominent role in society that women play today. They had, in some ways, clinging very strongly to the biases of their day in many areas. But in other areas, they were very far-sighted, like religious freedom. That's one thing that can be so exasperating when you look at the words and the writings and the actions of the founders, is to think how they could be so far-sighted and visionary in some areas and so backward and stuck in their time in others. And they were. But when it comes to religious freedom, what they gave us was a very powerful force that continues to reverberate through our society today. Remember, the founders came out of a European experience. Hundreds of years of church and state combined. What was the result of that? Violence, war, bloodshed, torture, terror. And some of these models had been duplicated in some of the colonies, where people were punished or even executed for having a faith that fell outside what the state thought was good and proper and true. So the founders knew all this history, and they were determined that there would be no establishment, no official religion at the federal level. Virginia was key to this experience. Virginia had an establishment of an Anglican church, favored by law. Everybody had to support it, whether you belonged to it or not. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote a law intending to disestablish the Church of England, the Anglican Church in Virginia, and guarantee to everybody the right to worship as guided by conscience. Well, there were some things going on in 1776 that sort of distracted from efforts to pass laws like that. So it wasn't until 1785 that Jefferson's famous Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom became law in Virginia, pushed through the legislature by his close ally, James Madison. When that bill was debated in the Virginia legislature, the Virginia statute, there was an effort made to limit its protection only to Christians. In other words, you could pick whatever religion you wanted to belong to as long as it were a variety of Christianity. But that failed. And when Madison wrote to Jefferson to tell Jefferson that his bill had passed intact as he had written it, Jefferson was ecstatic. And he wrote in his autobiography that his law was intended to, and I'm going to read the quote here, to protect within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. This is a broad vision of religious freedom, a vision that doesn't just include Christians, but that includes all these other denominations as well. This was the society that many of our founders sought to create. And we know that Jefferson's statute, Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, became a precursor to the First Amendment when that was added to our Constitution. James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution, a primary drafter of the First Amendment, took those ideas from Jefferson's Virginia Statute and put them in the First Amendment. Remember what I said about the Virginia Statute? It did two things: disestablished the Anglican Church in Virginia and guaranteed to everybody the right to worship as guided by conscience. Where else do you see those concepts? You see them in our First Amendment. So the Virginia struggle was really key to this history, and it points very clearly to a country, to a nation that is not officially founded on any version of Christianity. During the fight over the Virginia Statute, James Madison penned a famous document in 1785, the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, a document that essentially lists 15 reasons why no one should be compelled to support a Christian church against his or her will. So here's Madison arguing very strongly for the idea that no one should be forced to support a church, that everyone should have the right to make these decisions for themselves. There were pastors who argued very passionately for separation of church and state, even though they were themselves Christian. John Leland, who was an ally of Thomas Jefferson, who lived in Virginia for a while, but was originally from Massachusetts, once said, "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever." Leland believed very strongly that the government should have no say in how you worshiped, where you worshiped, or if you worshiped. This was the right of conscience that was due to all people without interference from the state. In 1802, Jefferson penned his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he spoke eloquently about the First Amendment erecting a wall of separation between church and state. People sometimes ask where that metaphor comes from. It comes from that letter. The Baptists in Connecticut were living under a Congregationalist theocracy at the time. They didn't like that. They wanted the right to worship as they saw fit. Yet here they were being forced to support this other church, because remember, at the time, the First Amendment applied only to the federal government, not to the states. That came later. So they wrote to Jefferson to say that they wished his view of religious freedom would extend to the whole country. And in replying to them and in agreeing with them, Jefferson invoked that famous metaphor. Now, as I said, there were a lot of people who felt differently at the time. There were pastors who thought the country would never survive if we didn't have a Christian establishment. There were political leaders like Patrick Henry who argued very strongly for a combination of church and state. Their views failed to carry the day. So the political views of the founders is the second line of evidence of key founders who bequeathed us religious freedom supported by a separation of church and state. The third line of evidence are the religious beliefs of these key founders. Would these founders have established a Christian nation were they themselves devout Christians? Now, I bring this up because there is an effort underway and has been going on for a long time by pseudo-historians in the Christian Nationalist camp, by David Barton and other folks who have tried to rewrite American history to portray key founders as kind of, Jerry Falwells in powdered wigs and stockings. But I can tell you that simply is not the case. Many of the key founders were either Christian rationalists or deists. They certainly weren't evangelical. Evangelicalism is a phenomenon that came later in American history. And they certainly weren't the types of individuals who would have felt, because of their personal religious beliefs, that everyone should worship as they did. George Washington is an interesting example, because although he was nominally an Anglican, he never took communion, and he tended to believe in religion as almost a social utilitarian thing. People needed religion to be good, they needed it to be moral, but an enlightened man, an educated person, knew better. Remember, we're talking about key founders being products of the European Enlightenment, that period where science became ascendant, and the idea of the supernatural ruling the world, which had been taken as a given for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages, began to finally fall by the wayside. Some founders, like Jefferson, sought ways to reconcile the Christian faith with a form of rationalism. Some of you may know that Thomas Jefferson took a copy of the New Testament, literally with a knife, cut out the parts he didn't believe in, and pasted up what was left to create his own private devotional. The Jefferson Bible, the Life and Morals of Jesus Christ, it sometimes is called, or the Jefferson Bible. What did Jefferson cut out of the New Testament? He cut out anything that smacked of supernaturalism or miracles. Jefferson's Jesus is a moral teacher. He's not divine. He's not the Son of God. He doesn't perform miracles. At the end of the Testament, Jesus is crucified, put in the tomb. That's the end of the story. There's no resurrection. Jefferson did not believe in these miraculous things, these incredible powers that were ascribed to Jesus, but he looked fondly on Jesus as a great moral teacher and wanted to separate the miracles from what he believed were these, as he called it, the sublime moral teachings of Christ. So that is a very deistic mode. Now, deism, which holds that there is a God that set the world in motion, then sort of stepped back from it, it sounds odd to today's ears because you don't run into a lot of people who practice deism. But in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, especially in the or 18th century before that, it was a very common religious view. People really believed that we could reconcile reason and science with faith. Jefferson once opined that a generalized form of Unitarianism would become the most popular religion in America. Now, with that statement, Jefferson proved that he was no prophet, but it tells you a little bit about how he was thinking and how he approached religion. And a famous letter that he wrote in 1819, Thomas Jefferson, writing to a friend, they were talking about religion, listed all the things that he did not believe in Christianity. And these include, I'm going to read you the list: the Immaculate Conception of Jesus, his deification, the creation of the world by him, his miraculous powers, his resurrection, his visible ascension, his corporeal presence in the Eucharist, the Trinity, original sin, atonement, regeneration, etc. So he listed basically what you consider to be the main tenets of Christianity and said that he didn't really believe in any of those. So that shows you where his mind was. John Adams, second president of the United States, was noted for his Unitarian views. John Adams did not believe in the Trinity. There's a story told about John Adams. He had a visitor to his house, an army officer, who wanted to convince John Adams that Christianity was true and that the Trinity was true. And they got to arguing and they got to debating and they were discussing this. And eventually the army officer grew frustrated and he fell back on an argument that many of you may be familiar with if you're arguing with someone who's very seriously religious. Eventually, when the argument's gone as far as it can and you've not been able to convince one another, the religious person may say something like, well, it's just a mystery. It's a divine mystery. It's beyond the understanding of our human powers. You have to take it on faith. John Adams, reflecting later about this argument, wrote to a friend, thus, mystery is a convenient cover for absurdity. So Adams very clearly thinking that some of the primary Christian doctrines were not only not true, but in a sense, even absurd. Again, very deistic in his point of view. Madison, perhaps our most enigmatic founder, very reluctant to talk about his religion. Unlike Jefferson, who engaged in vigorous private correspondence with friends, Jefferson once famously remarked about his religious views, I am a sect by myself as far as I know. Madison just didn't do that, didn't really talk about his religion once. Nominally an Anglican, never seemed particularly devout, and scholars still debate his views today, but clearly would not have been an advocate of the Christian nation because remember, he wrote the very first amendment that is such a blow to the Christian nation. So that's another line of evidence. Well, let's check out another one. After the Constitution was ratified and later the Bill of Rights, as I mentioned a moment ago, people reacted to this. They had feelings about it. They had opinions about it. And one of the things they did was they attacked the Constitution for being secular. There are sermons by pastors in the late 18th and early 19th century asserting that the government of the United States could never survive. The Constitution would collapse because we had not acknowledged God in our founding document. And actually, they sought to rectify this. During the Civil War, a group got started in the North called the National Reform Association, the NRA. It had a couple of different goals. It sought mandatory Sunday closing laws to shut down commerce and business on Sunday. It sought broadly based censorship of printed material that it considered to be blasphemous. It sought to ban the sale of the very few forms of birth control that existed at the time. And it sought to rewrite the preamble to the Constitution to add explicit references to Jesus Christ, God, and the Christian faith. Now think about this for a minute. The Christian nation argument is that the nation was founded to be Christian nation. If that were true, why would these ministers during the Civil War and after have proposed rewriting the preamble to put Christianity in the document? They did that because they were aware at that time that it was lacking, that it was missing, it wasn't in there, and they wanted to change that. Now, their Christian Nation Amendment was proposed in the 1870s and 1880s. It got a vote before a House committee at one point in the 1880s, was rejected. Obviously, we know this. It's not part of the Constitution. Amazingly, it was reintroduced in 1961, 1963, and 1965. So this thing has been floating around. We haven't seen it in recent years, but it was floating around in Congress in various forms for 100 years that would have explicitly stated that the United States was a Christian nation. They were trying to correct what they considered to be a fault or a defect in that document. And that is, again, more evidence that the Christian nation thesis must fail, because the spiritual sort of forefathers of Christian nationalists acknowledged the secular nature of the Constitution and tried to sort of fix that or repair that. Now, I want to say a few words about the origin of this myth, because I think it's important that we understand where it came from, because that tells us why it's had such staying power. The Christian nation myth is essentially a post-Civil War artifact. That's when it really began to gain steam. The National Reform Association, being unsuccessful in amending the Constitution, although they were successful in some of their other initiatives, they did get Sunday laws passed. They did manage to censor material they considered blasphemous. They did get laws passed banning birth control, but they never got the Christian Nation Amendment passed. Over time, the argument of those proponents kind of began to subtly shift. Instead of arguing that the nation, or acknowledging that the nation was secular and that this amendment was needed to make it Christian, they sort of started arguing that it had been Christian all along. And that myth was very validating to people. But think about the time that myth arose. The Civil War period and Reconstruction. Obviously, a very, very unsettling time for the entire nation. Half of the country lying in ruins, tens of thousands of people dead through this bloody war, the bloodiest conflict we had ever been involved in up until that point, on our own soil. When things are that unsettled, when things are that chaotic, when things are that confused and difficult, some people latch onto very simplistic answers to address their concerns and their fears. And extreme forms of fundamentalist religion become more popular. So the Christian nation myth began to fill that role for some people. It was a way of addressing our unsettled nature, let's put it that way. In fact, the phrase "in God we trust" first appeared on coins in the North during the Civil War because a minister in Pennsylvania had become convinced that the Civil War was a form of divine punishment from God because we had not recognized him in our Constitution. And therefore, we could put him on our coins and maybe that would placate him. So you started seeing some of these symbols of civil religion becoming more powerful during this time period. So that says a little bit about the origin. Well, why does it have such staying power today? Why is it still with us? You know, we're well removed from that period, yet you still have people today going about articulating and advocating for the Christian nation. What's that all about? Well, there are a couple of things I want to say about that. Number one is that the Christian nation myth feeds into the idea of our country as fundamentally good and decent and kind. I mean, as amazing as it may be to think about this in light of our history, our genocide of the Native people, our enslavement of African Americans, our suppression of women's rights, our suppression of the LGBTQ community, our xenophobia that's popped up over time again throughout our history. There are people who would like to suppress all of that and argue that we have always been fundamentally good because we are God's favorite nation. So the Christian nation myth becomes a way of kind of just papering over all that unpleasantness. Well, there must be a reason these things happen because we are a Christian nation. We're especially blessed by God. We have a special relationship with God. Think about how many times you've heard politicians say that or imply that. You know, they talk about the shining city on the hill that Reagan used to use so much from John Winthrop's sermon. This idea that there's this special relationship. The Christian nation excuses a lot of the ugliness in our history. The Christian nation also feeds into this idea that it's a really kind of a conspiracy theory but that there was this great, wonderful thing that we had in this country, this great Christian nation. We had this thing. And then somebody took it from us. Well, who took it from you? Well, it depends on who the enemy of the day is. Maybe members of minority communities or members of the LGBTQ community, immigrants, women, whoever you're choosing to demonize for political purposes. Secularists, atheists, humanists, they eroded the base of our great Christian nation. And now look at the chaos we have. I mean, this is an argument you hear a lot if you spend any time with Christian nationalists and their followers. So it feeds into this myth of the stolen legacy. And if you talk to Christian nationalists, a lot of them will pine for previous periods in history, especially the 1950s. Now, of course, they pine for the 1950s because Christian nationalists would like white, wealthy men to be in charge of everything, as they were in the 1950s. You don't hear a lot of folks from minority communities saying they want to go back to the Jim Crow era of the 1950s. You don't hear a lot of women saying they want to go back to the 1950s when they couldn't even work certain jobs or have their own credit. You certainly don't hear members of the LGBTQ community saying that they want to go back into the closet where they were in the 1950s. This sort of glorification of the 1950s is a white Christian nationalist artifact that they have brought in because that's when they had pretty much all their power, and they want to get that back. In the 1950s, 96% of Americans identified as Christian. The number now that identifies as Christian is somewhere between 60 and 65%. So we've seen a significant drop there, and that is alarming the Christian nationalist. The Christian nationalist myth also feeds into fears of social change. I've alluded to this a moment ago, just now. We have seen various rights movements come about in our society: the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, the non-believers rights movement. Now, most of us would look at these rights movements and we embrace them. We say that's the America we were always intended to be. That's the America we want to be. We welcome these rights movements. We want everybody to be involved in the American experiment to the fullest extent possible. But there are some people who are very frightened by those rights movements and argue that in America, where they get this idea, I don't know, there's only so much opportunity. So if you're giving it to some other folks, that means there's less for me. Well, we know that's not true, but there are people who very firmly believe that their rights are threatened by the expansion of rights for others. So the Christian nation myth sort of smooths over those societal fears they have. They're worried too much, too fast. The Christian nation myth tells them, oh, don't worry, we're going to get back to this golden era, like I said a moment ago. White male Christians ran everything and it was a paradise. Yes, it was a paradise for them, not for anybody else. The Christian nation myth is also a means to political power for some people. It is exploited very skillfully by politicians, and I'm sure you're aware of this. You see it in Florida, you see it in other states, where politicians will invoke this idea of the great Christian nation and getting back to that as a means of securing election, getting power, consolidating power. So it's cynically used, often by people who themselves can't be bothered to actually live a moral and decent life, but will invoke those tenets in order to get votes and secure power. And revisionism, as I mentioned a moment ago, Christian nation revisionism, is a bit of a conspiracy theory, holding that the people who believe in it have a kind of secret knowledge that's being suppressed. In many ways, the Christian nation advocates are to history what the creationists are to science. Think about what the creationists will tell you. Oh, well, the scientists say that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, but we know better. That knowledge has been suppressed. That science of what is really going on, that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, that's being suppressed. We have the real history, the real science. The Christian nationists argue the same thing. Yes, our great and glorious Christian nation history, if only you knew the real story, it's being suppressed by historians who don't want you to know it and this sort of thing. So it becomes definitely a bit of a conspiracy theory. That's some background. Now, I want to say a few words about where the Christian nation myth has led us, because it has been a powerful motivating force for a lot of people. It has influenced our politics. It continues to influence our politics. Primarily, it led to the rise, helped lead to the rise of what we used to call in the late 1970s and 80s the religious right. People like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and other TV preachers. Now we tend to use the term Christian nationalist when we're describing those forces. It motivated them, it provided funding for them, it was an avenue of political power, and it's brought us to a point where separation of church and state is basically under siege, and we're feeling that on all sides now. During the Trump years, we had significant changes at the US Supreme Court, leading the court to begin to drift away from the principle of separation of church and state. The court is now approving things like not just direct government funding of religious schools, but saying in certain cases, states may be required to extend that funding. Allowing a football coach to pray with students at the 50-yard line after a game, something that the court had never given its blessing to in previous years. Flirting with the idea that there may actually be a religious freedom-based right to discriminate against people outside of the church context. Now, everybody knows that a house of worship has the right to refuse membership and decline to give people its services if it doesn't want to do that. But we're not talking about houses of worship here. We're talking about bakeries, hotels, B&Bs, wedding website designers, people who print invitations, all sorts of businesses, photographers, and so on that are secular, clearly secular in their nature, saying, we're not going to serve you because you're gay, or you're not Christian, or you're an atheist, or you're a single mother. We don't approve of your lifestyle, excluding entire classes of people from public accommodations. Well, the last time we saw that was during the Jim Crow South, and we know how that turned out. So the idea that you can just say to somebody, we don't serve your kind here, go out, get out, is offensive to our national values, yet it is being reestablished, ironically, under the guise of religious freedom. Religious freedom, a powerful, important principle, is being made to wear the shabby cloak of discrimination. And that is an absolute shame. So we have this situation where separation of church and state under attack on many fronts, yet we must continue to fight to uphold it, because without it, America really isn't America anymore. It is so firmly ingrained in our culture and should be embraced by Americans that to lose it would be an absolute disaster. People talk about the different Christian nationalist organizations that are leading this onslaught. One of them is a group called Alliance Defending Freedom. They used to have some language on their site. They've since removed it probably because me and other folks kept talking about it. But they said their goal was, we seek to recover the robust Christian dogmatic theology of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. So this is what people are trying to get back to. Literally, the Byzantine era. This is what they're arguing for. So we find ourselves in a very difficult position right now. Reproductive rights under attack in a number of states since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. The literal banning and sometimes even burning of books, which I know you've seen in Florida, popping up in other states as well. And what do you know? The books just happen to be ones that deal with subjects that Christian nationalists don't like LGBTQ rights, or that discuss America's troubled racial history, all the material that they are trying to suppress. This wave of school voucher bills that are appearing in states like Florida and many others. In Florida, I know you have this broad sweeping plan now that basically gives anybody who wants one, even if you're extremely wealthy, a voucher to subsidize private education, which is usually private religious education, a direct attack on the very existence of public education. So we see this happening. We see these things going on. We see the attacks continue to come. And people sometimes ask, well, what are we going to do? I want to say a few words about that, and then I'll wrap up and move to your questions, because this is important. First thing we need to understand is the long-term nature of this fight. Struggle to regain and rebuild the wall of separation between church and state. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long-term project. As much as I deplore what Christian nationalists have done to this country, I must acknowledge that they had a long-term vision. Remember, it took them 49 years, almost half a century, to overturn Roe v. Wade, but they did it because they had a strategy. We need that mindset too. Some of us who are involved in this struggle may not live to see it come to fruition, but we must lay the groundwork for a new generation to pick up the fight. And that's what we're working. One of the things we're striving to do at Americans United. The good news is that if you look at some of the polling data, generally you find that younger people aren't really interested in fighting these culture war issues, especially the ones that deal with LGBTQ rights. There's much more acceptance in those younger communities. So if that pattern holds, we can hope that as those folks become older and assume leadership positions, that they'll be rejecting the extreme politics that so often mark our society today. We need to think creatively about how we approach some of these issues. At Americans United, we've been looking at our legal program, realizing that it's going to be challenging to have cases dealing with some issues in the federal courts right now, but maybe there are things we can do in the state courts. We have filed a lawsuit earlier this year in Missouri, challenging that state's restrictions on abortion, which are quite severe. When those laws were passed, legislators in Missouri, state legislators, got up and openly quoted from the Bible. They quoted religious scriptures. They talked about their personal faith to justify the passage of these bills. Well, laws in the United States are supposed to have a secular rationale, not a religious one. And the Missouri Constitution actually contains stronger church state language than you find in the federal document. So we are arguing that this blatant attempt to pass laws on the basis of religious belief and Bible passages is a violation of the separation of church and state. We're going to be working as much as we can to help and defend people who are under attack in the courts. Even though our own litigation efforts may be scaled back a little bit, we know that the Christian Nationalist legal groups will continue to bring new lawsuits, and they may sue public schools, they may sue private individuals, they may sue lots of people and entities. And some of those folks are asking us for help, and we're going to provide that as much as we can. Even if we know the cases are hard to win, we're going to do our best to mitigate the damage and give those schools the representation that they deserve. I mentioned the coach who was praying at the 50-yard line with students. We represented that school district, Bremerton, Washington, all the way to the Supreme Court. The coach sued the school, backed by an aggressive religious right legal organization. That school deserved the best representation it could get, and that's where our lawyers came in. We knew that was going to be a difficult case. We knew we were almost certain to lose, but they made great arguments and I think mitigated some of the damage there. So as much as possible, we're going to be doing that too, to help people who are under attack by these aggressive religious right organizations. We can't just let them out there. We have to do what we can to help them understand that there is a force out there that cares about them and wants to help them. At the same time, we are launching what we're calling a national recommitment to the principles of separation of church and state. And this begins with a simple act, asking people to pledge their support for church-state separation. Now, in a way, it's kind of sad that we have to do that because it's such a basic principle to American life, but we found that it is. So if you go to our website, which is simple, au.org, so www.au.org/pledge, you will find that you can sign this pledge to endorse the idea of separation of church and state. Share that with your friends, give it to allied communities, share that widely on social media. We want to get that out as much as we can. That's the first step. Second step is we're going to commit some money to a campaign that helps people understand how separation of church and state is really at the base of so many of the rights that they take for granted every day. Reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, the right to learn, the right to read, the right to challenge. All of that rests on a separation of church and state. The separation of church and state, sometimes I think about a helpful way to envision this is, Jefferson spoke about that wall of separation between church and state. Well, visualize in your mind an actual brick wall, tall wall made of bricks. On top of that wall rests religious freedom, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, the right to read, the right to learn, and a host of others. If Christian nationalists undermine that wall to the point where it collapses, what happens to all those rights resting on top of that wall? They fall into the rubble. And we can't let that happen. So as much as we can, we are going to be advocating for this national recommitment. And we're going to need your help. And I would just say to you that this is a noble struggle, not just important, but noble. Defending separation of church and state, defending religious freedom is not a burden. It is a privilege. It is an honor. And I would invite you to join in that struggle, because that's the only way we're going to kind of turn these things around. And it is, I would submit to you, a very powerful force and a way to add a lot of meaning to your life. These have been difficult times. And I would submit to you that all of us, no matter how we reacted to them, someday may be asked, well, what did you do during this struggle? How did you respond when the rights of your neighbors were under attack, the rights of your friends were under attack, the rights of your children, your loved ones, or even your own rights were under attack? How did you react? And your answer could be that you disengaged, or you got tired, or you were afraid, you cowered. But I don't think you want that to be your answer. I think you want your answer to be, I stood up, I fought back. I didn't win every battle, but I was always there. And I laid the groundwork for some important work that will, as I mentioned earlier, bear good fruit, even if you're not here to see it. That is the struggle. That is the fight we have today. That is the battle. And it gives me no pleasure to use these militaristic terms and metaphors, but they are what is often employed by the other side, who sees themselves, who sees their organizations as involved in a struggle, as they would put it, for the very soul of America. And when they talk about the soul of America, they talk about that in a very narrow sense. An America that preferences a certain very extreme, very fundamentalist, very narrow version of Christianity. A version of Christianity that would ironically exclude millions of Christians alongside non-Christians and non-believers. That's their soul of America. If you think about soul in kind of a non-theistic way, as a motivating force moving through our country, I see a much different type of soul of America. I see a soul of America where we expand rights, we don't pull them back. We welcome people seeking to live according to the way their conscience tells them when it comes to faith or no faith. I see a soul of America that celebrates the right of young people to read, to learn, to question, to doubt, to grow. I see the soul of America as encompassing the rights of women to have bodily self-autonomy. I see the soul of America as embracing your right to be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Wiccan, pagan, atheist, humanist, or to simply say, as a lot of people are doing these days, I'm not sure where I stand. I'm still sorting that out. What an incredible gift we were given by those founders who crafted our religious freedom. That is what is at stake today, that real soul of America. And that is the soul, the principle that I invite you to join me in defending. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rob. That's fantastic. I appreciate everything you had to say. We're going to open up for questions now. Rob, get a sip of water or whatever you got to do. But I'm sure there's lots and lots of questions. If you do have a question, please use the emoji thing and your reactions and raise your hand that way so I can see how and who is asking a question. But let me start it off with this, Rob, because you mentioned it's a long-term nature, this fight, and you apologize for using militaristic terms, but it's a long-term fight, which begins with the First Amendment. I'm wondering if the First Amendment is not part of the problem, in that it codifies religion by the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause as the supreme law of the land, that we must address religion. Suppose religion had no such codification relative to the Constitution and was only relegated to the same protections as a philosophy club. Would that solve your problem?
The challenge with any language in the Constitution is always that it's who's interpreting it. There was a movement in the 19th century to actually expand the protections of the First Amendment and make things a little bit more explicit and address some of these issues in a more direct way through an amendment that was sponsored by a senator known as James G. Blaine. So people call that the Blaine Amendment. Now, that didn't pass. It didn't become part of the federal constitution, although some states adopted versions of it. But the difficulty is that somebody, and usually a court, a Supreme Court at the federal or state level, has to interpret what that language says. And sometimes, as explicit as you want to be, unfortunately, political justifications do work their way into some of those decisions. So I think what you're saying is very interesting, but I also think we need to be aware, and I say this representing an organization that's legally nonpartisan, you do need to be aware of how the courts and the political system interact and the connections thereof. That's very important.
Well, yeah, obviously we need to be aware of all of that. I agree with you 100%. Do you find yourself straddling the wall?
Could you clarify a little bit what you mean by that?
Well, are you on one side of the wall or the other side of the wall? And here's what I mean by that. If your problem were actually solved relative to separating the Americans from church and state, what would that look like? What would success look like?
Right. That's a good. Thank you. That's a good point. We talked about the First Amendment and its two provisions: no establishment, free exercise. Some people like to pretend that those are in conflict, but I don't think the founders designed a system where those were meant to be in tension. I really don't. I think they're meant to complement one another. And certainly the idea that you will be able to choose your own religion and make those decisions for yourself is protected by the idea that there's no establishment. Because there's no official church and there's no government preference toward any one faith, you're then free to make that decision for yourself. At the same time, we must acknowledge that religious freedom, as important a principle as it is, has limitations. Your religious freedom can't become an excuse to cause harm or injury to other people. And I think right now what we're seeing is a theory of religious freedom gaining traction at the Supreme Court that allows for those types of harms. And I think that's very unfortunate, because that does take the free exercise provision, and to my mind, it elevates it up above establishment to the point where religious freedom suddenly becomes a tool to cause other people damage. And I just don't think that that's something that the founders would have ever contemplated, and certainly not embraced.
So what would success look like?
Success to me would look like a fully secular state, a state that says the government has no opinion on what you do religiously or whether you even do anything religiously. The government doesn't have an opinion on whether there's one God, no God, 5 gods, or 20 gods. The government doesn't base its laws on religious rationale. The government doesn't subject people to any kind of religious coercion in any setting. All of these views, whether they are religious or philosophical, are truly considered on an even playing field. Now, in theory, that even playing field is supposedly what we have right now. But as a matter of fact, religion is preferenced in many ways in our culture, both culturally and legally. And it can be difficult for non-religious people to get that same right of access. I mean, think about how often you go to a meeting of the government and they open up with some type of religious prayer or religious statement. And maybe once a year, a secular person comes in and says something not, secular. That's hardly equal. Well, the answer to that is to simply stop those types of statements, stop those types of prayers, get the government out of the business of officially praying. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court a few years ago upheld the ability of governments to do that.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move. Let's go around the room. Everybody gets to ask a question. There's plenty of time for everybody to ask one question. Keep your questions short and to the point if you can. Let's go to Steve Stoll from Thailand.
Yes, hi, thank you. I was just, with what you just said and what Ken was saying, it seems to me that the ability to succeed has been very much limited by the current makeup of the Supreme Court. And all of the cases that you're going to bring or that the ACLU brings in any state at some point is going to be before this court, the Catholic court, and it's not going to go well. Do you think, and does the organization support the expansion of the Supreme Court? My feeling is that if Biden gets reelected, the first thing he needs to do is add to the court. And I read something from some legal expert that said 15 makes sense. 5 liberals, 5 conservatives, and 5 appointed by the law community, the bar. And that, but from what you said and from what Ken was suggesting, it seems like anything we do is in jeopardy because of the makeup of the Supreme Court. So I know that you don't typically take political positions, but I'm not sure it is a political position. If you're interested in the separation of church and state, you need to have a Supreme Court that's able to be an umpire, that's able to call balls and strikes. And the current makeup of the Supreme Court is not able to do that. We saw they already took away abortion rights, gay rights is next, birth control is next. Every agenda item of the Christian right and the Catholic Church, even more the Catholic Church than the Pope himself, is the current makeup of the Supreme Court. So anyway,
Well, there are a lot of issues certainly with the Supreme Court, absolutely, not the least of which is that they don't have to follow the ethical standards that are imposed upon all the other federal courts, which, to me, that seems like a logical place to start, is getting them under those rules. We have not formally endorsed court expansion, although that is the discussion that is underway in our organization as we look at ways to address the concerns that we have right now. Court expansion may be something to look at. It does concern me that a future conservative president could then expand the court even more, and you could eventually end up with a very unwieldy body. So we do have to be careful. But there are certainly things, there are interim steps, or other things that folks have suggested, term limits and so on, staggered appointments. So nothing has been endorsed by us officially as an organization, but maybe stay tuned. Those discussions are underway.
It seems to me if you focus on this secular, professional 5, rather than simply the number, you would get around this constantly making the court larger and larger. In other words, if you focus on, being a fair court, and fair means 5 liberals, 5 conservatives, and 5 umpires. It seems like that might get around this constant expansion argument. But
an interesting argument. Absolutely, yes.
All right, let's go to Fred. Fred, unmute yourself.
Hello. First of all, because anything that we speculate would be under the current political environment would be almost impossible. not entirely impossible, but highly unlikely for the foreseeable future. But I also like to say how well, even the Civil War amendments, the 13, 14, and 15 amendments, those only became possible because of the Civil War. Because of all those states, 11 states that had left, that tried to leave the Union, formed the Confederacy, if all their representatives and senators had been still part of the Congress for the remainder of the 1800s, the 13th Amendment would never have been passed, or very unlikely to have been passed, neither the 14th or 15th Amendments, because they would have blocked it. Even when they were a minority, they still had just enough power to prevent those from passing. And it was only because of the circumstances of the Civil War. And even then, the 13th Amendment barely passed. It didn't pass when they tried voting for it in 1864, but then finally passed in early 1865, just shortly before Lincoln was assassinated. And he was assassinated because it was sore losing jerk decided he's promoting vote for blacks. How dare he do that? I got to shoot him. So it's gonna, and then we go to our Supreme Court now. I think a lot of us are people that follow the Supreme Court from the say the maybe the 1940s or from the era of FDR through maybe the early 70s. Think, okay, the Supreme Court was very progressive in that period, but that was really an anomaly. From just one article I recently read about how the Supreme Court uses have been about maintaining the conservative status quo. Sometimes
there are periods where the Supreme Court has been fairly progressive. We can point to those areas, the Warren Court, the Burger Court to some extent, and some periods where they did some things like that. But oftentimes it has been a fairly conservative body. So at Americans United, I mean, as we continue these discussions, I think we need to have an attitude of really looking at, putting a lot of things on the table, seeing where that leads us. But we at least need to have these discussions because the situation we're in is, just so unprecedented and kind of horrifying in a way.
And it does matter who is the president, and as well as the makeup of the Senate, because that played a very vital role in what happened with overturning Roe. Because it doesn't matter who was the president, who got to make the appointments.
Do you have any further questions, Fred?
That's it.
Okay, let's go to Wendell. Thank you, Fred.
Hello, wonderful folks. Thank you for having me. I apologize if I should trigger anyone. Where I am currently, I recognize everybody as the valid, viable human being that they are. And from my take, learning this now because of certain situations, we need to, as far as getting more, in my opinion, secular judges, because you have some who are proving that they are going by what their holy scripture says, not what the Constitution says. And so basically, it's like crackheads voting or trying to pass laws and say, yes, they have every right to steal your VCR. And you're like, no, you could be on crack. I just don't want my VCR to be stolen, kind of thing. And I'm like, hey, let's get this ship, because it's not just one thing. It's the eugenics of the white and the black. It's the eugenics of some religion and some sub-religion. Somebody is always thinking, believing that they're better than some other human being. And like I said, where I am currently with the science that shows, we're all one race living on one planet, whichever part of the planet you are from, whatever language you speak, it doesn't matter to me. You are a valid, viable human being. I don't know how we exist, but when I've investigated those other ones that have been presented to me, who's the volcano god, the wolf god, the whichever god it is, you could see that those aren't it, right? And you're like, but even though I don't have the answer, I know that those aren't it, and I'm not telling you to not worship. I'm just saying, if you could start thinking logically, You will, because logic is like math. It's the absolute. It's not like, well, I am 5'4" and my math is different to yours because you're 6'2". It is what it is. And so with the United States Constitution giving you the right to be that individual, adult, and to think would not harm anybody else, that is the thing that some of these people can't get into. Well, it's not that they can't. They love that power and control so much that they refuse to acknowledge that they also know that you're not taking their rights away. You're just saying, don't take my rights away based on your God or whatever it is, doctrine. So thank you. How do we get more secular people? Because I have had issues and I've gone to attorneys' offices and I see that attorney's prayer. And I'm like, on plaques, on little things on the wall. And I'm like, what kind of system am I in here? And I'm technically in a small city, a growing city, but they still have, the majority still have that, may God guide my hands, or whatever the hell that, anyway,
Right.
I shut up. I blather too much.
Right. Well,
How do we get,
your question is, how do we get more secular?
right, right.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the first step is to make secularism not be a dirty word. One of the things that Christian nationalists have managed to do over the past several decades is portray secularism as a corrosive force, something that is in opposition to religion, that threatens religion. But secularism is not the enemy of religion. Secularism is in many ways the protector of religion, because a secular state says, what you decide to do about religion is up to you. We're not going to interfere as long as you respect other people's rights. And the state is going to be neutral on these matters. Now, we know that our state is not neutral right now. Our state preferences religion, and it preferences belief in many ways. If we could get to a system where we have a respect for secular government, then I think a respect for secular people naturally follows. Now, interestingly, if you look at the demographic data in the United States, you do see some fairly significant changes underway right now. During my remarks, I mentioned about the drop in number of people who said that they identify as Christian. People are stepping away from organized religion in larger numbers. Doesn't mean they're necessarily embracing humanism or atheism or free thought, but they are taking that step away. And that is helpful, because the more diversity you have in a society, the less likely it is that any one group can get too much power and start to assert control. So again, a long-term project, but one well worth pursuing, to just build up respect for the idea of secularism as a positive social good.
Okay. It's interesting that that's a long-term project. That the word secular has become so demonized that it has to be a project of AU, and that you're probably spending money and funding on that. I assume you are, and how to make secularism more acceptable and understandable. Let's go to Mary Wall. Mary, are you there?
Thank you. Thank you. I guess just some brief, personal viewpoints or whatever. I guess when Trump was first elected, my particular church went far left. I am a centrist, I'm a Democrat, but I'm a centrist, and I didn't really like it that much. But more or less, my minister was saying things like basically disregard the law, basically, I guess self-righteousness is so much more important or whatever. Well, I have to admit, the law hasn't always been perfect, but I personally, as the legal secretary, I do not advocate chaos. I think, like Catholic Church especially is considered, the law doesn't basically rule us. We'll handle ourselves, because basically God is above the law of any land. So at the same time as saying it's a Christian nation, they're saying basically they don't support its laws. And I did work for, I guess, one lawyer. He was, I guess, Baptist or something, probably Northern, basically. He didn't really seem all that, religious or something. But, I sort of liked him. But basically, his take on the law would be, him being a lawyer, was the law should be the minimum standard of conduct. I guess, I had to agree with that. If you're going to have liberty, if you're going to have freedom, you can't micromanage everything. Well, I don't like how high my neighbor's hedge is, so I'm going to make a law, so I guess, in terms of having liberty and freedom, basically, I would prefer a secular society rather than one that more or less tells me how I'm supposed to feel, tells me what I'm supposed to believe, and anyway, I think in order to be fair to the most people, that even if the law isn't perfect, I'm not advocating chaos. People, more or less go to the self-righteous. Well, to some people, that was Matthew Shepard. Basically, because of their religion, they were self-righteous in doing that. Witch burnings in Salem, Hawthorne, Scarlet Letter, a lot of things are done in terms of, personal self-righteousness. And, I really don't advocate giving yourself an excuse to do any darn thing you want,
So Mary,
not chaos.
what's your
So
question? Mary, your question.
Oh, it was a statement. It wasn't a question. I said it was a personal point of view. Then I'm finished. So go ahead.
Okay. Do you have a question for Rob?
I would say one thing about that. So we're talking about sort of the law and the supremacy of the law and the rule of law, which is very important because we can see what happens when that isn't followed. I mean, January 6, 2021 is a good example of that. At the same time, I do think there are ways to push back against laws we consider to be unjust that don't involve violence or chaos or anything like that. In some states, laws are being proposed, and maybe they've been passed in a few, I don't know for certain, but the idea is that not only is abortion going to be legal in this particular state, but if you leave the state to get an abortion, you could be punished when you come back. Or if anybody helps you leave the state to get one somewhere else, that person can be punished too. Well, the only way we're going to get laws like that overturned is if people basically break them and then go into court and challenge them very aggressively. So it is a form of civil disobedience, but to my mind, it's a very non-violent form, and that is how laws change sometimes. If you think about other periods in our history, that strategy was used successfully to change these unjust laws. So I would say there's a way to do that that doesn't involve violence and chaos, which nobody wants.
While I, do recognize the idea of civil disobedience, there's always been, you have the right to do what you want, but there's consequences to that too. But, more recently, there's been the militarization of police departments and stuff. And basically in Portland, I guess, there was a peaceful protest. There were things about, buses being sent in to deliberately escalate. Well, the National Guard got sent in, basically, whether they were wanted or not. Attorney General Barr was talking about suspension of constitutional rights. So basically, how far do you dare go in terms of protests? Just in terms of giving Trump an excuse to send in the National Guard.
People have to decide that for themselves. I mean, how far they're willing to go. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when you're out protesting, even if you're protesting peacefully, you can be attacked. Absolutely. We can see that. So everybody has to be at their own comfort level. But I do think there are ways to challenge these laws that don't always involve violence. Someone was asking about if there's any cause for hope, and I saw that in the chat. And can I address that, Ken?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I think there is. Think about some of the fallout from the overturning of Roe in even red states where people went to the ballot box and by popular referendum supported those rights and built them into their their laws. Now, I know that it can vary from state to state what you can do with a ballot referenda. I mean, the ballot referenda is more challenging in some states than others. But I do think it shows that there is support for some of these ideas if we can use those vehicles to make changes. I mean, I wish that they weren't necessary, but sometimes it is, and that's a vehicle we maybe need to be looking at a little more aggressively, not just on reproductive rights, but other areas as well.
Okay, I hope that addresses the question. That was a question from the chat. I appreciate you, Rob, for responding to that. Let's go to Bernard McCarthy. Bernard, you're muted. Unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
There was a case report in the New York Times today called 16 Crucial Words That Went Missing from a Landmark Civil Rights Law. It's a very short, relatively short article, and I can't really get my mind around whether it would be of any help in this area or not. But a lot of the civil rights laws, Civil War, have been broadly and by prior courts expanded. what is based upon is an opinion by a circuit, I think it's the Fifth Circuit, by a judge appointed by President Trump, finding a law review article by, I think, a professor at Delaware or a school in New York State, that between the time of the passage of what became known as 1983 and 1871, and it being incorporated into the official report by the reporter at the time, 16 words were missing. And this is a basis for the qualified immunity doctrine, where the Supreme Court has held that unless there is some law or case which has been decided, which clearly tells a police officer or somebody else that they're in violation of the law, then they have qualified immunity. And these 16 words clearly state that state laws are nullified with respect to the protection given by the civil rights laws at the time, which, as he says, completely turns things on its head and presents a very interesting question for originalists. Because here's the statute, which, if read in its original way, is going to significantly change the law. So I'm hoping that somewhere along the line to see a case with Justice Jackson reiterating her point, which I thought was just marvelous, of taking originalism as of the time of what some people refer to the second or third founding, that is the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution and the civil rights laws at that time, and what the original intent there was, and contrasting that to what originalists are trying to put in the Constitution. I don't know if you're aware of that case or if there's been any consideration yet. It's very early. I don't know when it was decided, but the Times just reported it today.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure our legal department probably is following that.
Well, I'm sure they are.
While racism isn't
Mary, before you go, let me ask Bernard a question. Bernard, do you have a question specifically, other than is Rob aware of the case? Do you have another question for Rob? No. Okay. All right. That's fine. All right.
okay. Well, while racism is not an insignificant issue, it's somewhat of a red herring. There's all this chaos every freaking day. There's some sort of mall shooting or school shooting. The police officers in Uvalde failed to react. How many school shootings? How many AK-47s are there going to be where basically policemen risk their lives and they don't more or less, at least for the temporary, make AK-47 or AK-15s or whatever they are illegal. Now you got the border crossings. Basically, where are the police going to act and when are they not? When are they going to risk their lives when basically this chaos is being deliberately provoked?
Actually, let me say one thing about that, because we're not, we're not a gun control group. We don't address that issue. But what I am kind of frustrated about right now, not only with guns or some other issues, is religion being used as an excuse to do nothing, to even avoid the discussion. So in the wake of one of these shootings, how often do you hear people say, well, thoughts and prayers? Okay, well, thoughts and prayers. And
yeah, well, the shootings, that's somebody doing something.
Right. And then what? Well, we're not going to do anything else because we have the thoughts and prayers.
It's less worse than doing nothing.
Right. It's frustrating because what's happening is religion, instead of sort of determining the course of the law, which has been a problem in this country in recent years, is used to not enact any laws. And that's equally problematic, I think, from a church state standpoint. If our laws are being subjected to some kind of review from religious organizations or being shut down from even being proposed because of pressure from religious groups or religious excuses, we're not any better off there.
Yeah, well, there's Citizens United, there's a Privacy Act, all under W, and there's a whole lot more, under W, and like global economics and all sorts of things. So whatever, enough said for now.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Other questions, other comments? Wendell.
Yeah, so I am currently in Tennessee, and when I saw some footage of the one of the legislators asking, if he knows why he's in the pit. That brought what you call some vibes of stuff I've seen, photos, where I guess it's before or after church, where they would go randomly choose a person and hang them and burn them and cut off body parts. And I'm like, man, I've got to get out here. And I am searching for as many groups who are holding demonstrations, to have some common sense. So, in solidarity with them, and stand and say, hey, because recently they said, hey, has anybody had, any family members? No immediate family members have been shot in mass shootings for me, but I'm in solidarity because I remember something about they came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak up, and they came for the communists and now they are here for me and there's nobody here left to speak up for me. And I'm like, I'm not, I mean, we have to put an end to this insanity. This is 2023/4721 according to the Chinese calendar. Let's go. I mean, I do become
Wendell,
frustrated.
do you have a question?
No, I just needed to make a statement and say how frustrating it is that it's 2023 and we're still with this insanity.
Yes.
Oh,
Well, you're
Thank
among
you.
friends. Wendell, you're among friends. But no, Wendell raises a good point, Rob. Yeah, and it kind of ties into something you said earlier relative to the success that those who sought to overturn Roe v. Wade have had, and how long they prepared for the process, and how long they were involved in the process of overturning Roe v. Wade. It goes back decades. You didn't necessarily say that, but that's my observation. So, and then you said, though, we need to prepare in a similar fashion. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by us preparing, other than dealing with the word secular? Let's put that word aside. And what are you talking about? How do we better prepare?
Right. Well, remember, those folks had a multi-pronged strategy, one arm political, one arm legal. Now, there are some things that they did that are not legal for nonprofit 501c3 organizations to do. And I'm not suggesting that anybody break the law here. Do the partisan political work through the appropriate vehicles. But they had these, this plan in mind. And one of the things that they did was that if the law that they managed to get passed was struck down, they would just look at it and rewrite it and put it back up again. And eventually the laws weren't being struck down anymore. They were being embraced and upheld. So it's very important to realize that there's a political strategy that needs to be involved, and there's a legal strategy. And also that we need to understand that some issues that are not church state issues are important and they need to be on our radar screen. I'm talking about things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, and other issues that are designed to dilute the power of certain communities in politics. Because the current communities that are being targeted for suppression are progressive voices, usually, whether they're young people, minorities, whatever they might be. Those are the ones that the white Christian nationalists don't want showing up on election day. So voter suppression is not a church state issue, but it's one we need to be aware of, involved with, and reaching out to new allies to address, because all this will be for naught if the people who want to access the ballot in a way that it could be helpful can't do that. But again, we're nonpartisan and we're not allowed to endorse or oppose candidates, so we don't do that. But there are other groups out there that are specifically designed to address these issues, and that's where the work should be done.
How much time do you think we need?
That's a really good question. And I have been grappling with that myself. It's going to take some time. I wish that I could be a little more hopeful about that, but It's just a situation that we're going to need to be looking ahead 20, 30, 40, maybe even more years. That's why I keep saying that some of us who are working on this may not live to see the results, but if we can lay the groundwork, we will have spent our lives well.
Fair enough. Let's go to Susan. A question for Rob.
Yes, thank you. I think you partly answered my question, because my question was about voting, because we've got these extremist judges and justices now, and part of that is because people aren't voting. So AU is nonpartisan and they're 501c3. But if we don't get people out there to vote, if they're agnostic about voting, or they, so many, Trump got elected, DeSantis got elected in Florida. I think DeSantis's voucher expansion bill maybe was bribing religious people by, subsidizing their kids' religious education. So those people are all going to come out and vote for him. So what can AU do to motivate people to vote for an interpretation of church-state separation, which would be interpreting it that the government doesn't hand out money to religious organizations?
Right. Well,
I don't know. I rambled on.
No, that's fine. As I said, we can't endorse or oppose candidates or political parties, but we can certainly encourage people to vote, just as good civic behavior. And we can also encourage them to talk to candidates, to go to forums, to ask pointed questions, find out where people stand. One of the things that's really important right now, with all the problems we're having with public education, like attacks on books and attacks on the very concept of public education, is who is sitting on your school board. And you can find that out, and you can go to forums and you can ask questions and smoke these folks out, with some pointed questions about censorship and diverting money through voucher plans, and whether they really support public education, because people will run for these offices who don't actually support public education, who really want to bring it down. And by getting on the board, that's how they do it. So you begin with things like that. We're just, getting that information out there. That's all legal. We can provide that type of information. We just can't tell people, how they ought to mark their ballots. Now, some organizations that have C3 status are moving ahead with forming allied organizations like C4 organizations. And from that, you can do political action committees. So there are things to look at there, but we have historically been a C3, we've historically been nonpartisan. So I think we're going to stick with the legal ways we can interact with the political system, and leave the organizations that have the specific partisan focus to do their work.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Rob, if you would describe the difference between separation and segregation.
Right. Well, separation to me is, it's in the context what we're talking about here with separation of church and state. That's a positive force. Now, it doesn't mean that church and state can have no interaction. It simply means that there's reasonable controls in place to make sure that the state doesn't lapse into the idea of subsidizing, promoting, or advocating for religion. That the job of spreading a religious message always relies on those religious communities, that's what they're responsible for. Now, segregation to me is cordoning off, putting individuals or classes of individuals away from larger society, treating them differently because of who they are. It's a negative thing. So we don't necessarily want that for the relationship between church and state. What we want is a situation where, both institutions can prosper in their own way, but they're not relying on one another. Now, some of you might have been watching the coronation in England recently with King Charles III, and I didn't watch most of it, but I saw some snippets, especially about how religion was treated. And of course, it's a much different system than the way we do things here. You have all this pomp and ceremony, and there was one point where these religious leaders came forth, and Charles is the defender of the faith and all this sort of thing. They have a much different situation in some of these European nations. We made a deliberate break with that system for a reason. It doesn't allow religious freedom to prosper. So the separation idea isn't punishing religion. It's not treating religion like it's a bad thing. It simply is allowing people to make those choices on their own without the state interfering or taking a stand.
All right. Fred, are you there? Unmute yourself, Fred. You got a question for Rob?
Yeah, you know, how, you said we can't give, endorse particular candidates or so forth, at a party. But how can they respond? How can, AU respond to churches that very much they vote for this person or you're going to hell. Vote for this party or you're going to hell, or so forth, because that does happen.
It does happen,
Especially over the last
absolutely, and
decade or so.
that is illegal. Churches, houses of worship hold the same 501c3 tax status as Americans United and other nonprofits. They also are not allowed to endorse or oppose candidates. Now, we know that they do it. And honestly, this happens on both sides of the aisle, and it shouldn't happen anywhere. We have in the past reported those churches to the IRS. And in a couple cases, now this was back in the late 80s and early 90s, the IRS actually did crack down on a couple cases like that. And one case, the only time this has happened in history, a church in New York State actually lost its tax exempt status for endorsing candidates. Now, then a few others were warned about it, but for various reasons that are complicated and not something I really want to get into here tonight. Around 2008, 2009, the IRS kind of, in reaction to some court rulings, kind of pulled back on the enforcement. So we're not seeing the aggressive enforcement of that law, which is, by the way, called the Johnson Amendment, dates to 1954. We're not seeing that like we'd like to. One of the things we've been asking people to do is, if you come across instances of this where a church or a house of worship is clearly violating the standard by the pastor, standing up in a pulpit, telling people to vote for candidate Smith or whatever, or putting signs up or passing out material for that candidate, you can let us know, or you can report it to the IRS yourself. And that lets the IRS know that there is, a desire among the American people to see this law enforced, and maybe they'll get back to the position where they're enforcing it again.
Thank you.
Okay. Other comments or questions for Rob? Anybody have a comment or a question for Rob? Okay, Rob, quick answer, quick question. Your opinion, what's liberating about religious liberty?
I think what's liberating about it is that properly applied, it allows you to make your own decision as guided by your conscience. And also, you can change your mind. It's one of the great things about America is there's really no such thing as being an apostate. In some of the hardline Muslim nations, if you deviate from state-imposed orthodoxy, you can be fined, imprisoned, or even killed. And here, you are free to make your own decisions about these things. I mean, how many times have you heard people talk about they were raised in a certain particular faith and then they became something else or left religion entirely? That is very liberating, to know that we have that absolute right to make these decisions for ourselves, to blend spiritual traditions if you want. If you marry somebody who's from another faith, you can take a little bit of their tradition, add your own, or you can create your own particular faith. People have done that in this country. Entire religious denominations have been started in America. The Mormons are probably the best example, but there are others. So you just have this freedom and this ability to worship or not as your conscience dictates. And that to me is that is absolutely liberating. Absolutely.
As your conscience dictates, that's what's liberating to it.
Yeah, and as I said, the ability to change your mind, to explore, to question, and to doubt. Remember this too, in the modern era, law does not recognize blasphemy. So if you're a free thinker, if you're an atheist, if you're a humanist, you can take pot shots at religion all day, and you really can't be punished for that. There are nations right now on this globe where that is an illegal act, and you can be killed for that.
Yeah.
Bear that in mind.
Right. No, that's a real That's real world stuff. Are you concerned, and I know there are people in this room who are concerned, that that kind of idea or action could happen in this country if we did not have some organization like Americans United for separation of church and state trying their best to understand what this is like to keep the church and state separate? We don't want to return to what it was like before 1776 in England, and we don't want to move forward to what it might be like in Afghanistan or other countries that exist today. Are you concerned if we don't have an organization like AU that that would happen in America right now in the 21st century?
I think what's more likely to happen in this country is the steadily erosion of our rights in certain key areas where it becomes very difficult to be a member of a dissenting faith or a non-believer. For instance, if the Supreme Court continues to erode the principle of separation of church and state as it applies to public education, schools might start reinstituting Christian prayer, Christian worship, and that's going to affect a lot of young people, that sort of thing. If we get to a situation where the Supreme Court embraces a theory of religious freedom that says religious freedom can be used as a tool of discrimination and treating people like second-class citizens, denying them certain types of health care, denying them access to birth control, that's going to affect a lot of people. If we get to a situation where school districts are banning books and removing things from material, not teaching accurate history, obviously that has an effect too. I don't think it's going to be like The Handmaid's Tale. That's an incredibly powerful novel, and I recommend it if you haven't read it. But it will be more like this steady erosion, drip, 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 where you just continue to start lose your rights for this de facto, what I would call a de facto establishment of a conservative form of Christianity that excludes millions of people, many of whom actually are Christian.
Okay. A question from Christina. Do you have a question for Rob?
Yeah, I was wondering, so in the focus on the Supreme Court, I'm thinking the Supreme Court is going off of the Constitution. And so I'm thinking the problem is the Constitution, because it was, what was it? Wasn't it white landowners or something that wrote it? So if women are not even in the Constitution as equal, then, how can we get, isn't everything under that? And so then like these judges are going under this thing and they're like, we're making decisions off of this document and the document's bad. So isn't the thing we want to do is to make women equal in the Constitution?
Well, as I'm sure you know, the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, did not pass, but there are methods and mechanisms by which the Constitution can be amended. Now, it's not an easy step, but it has happened several times in our history. You can see the amendments are there. So I would say that, while the Constitution is an important document, it's a product of its time, as you point out, mainly drafted by white landowning men and reflects a lot of that type of spirit. And we can change it if we so choose. Again, not an easy thing to do, takes a lot of time, but like a lot of things I've talked about tonight, there's a bit of a long-term nature to these things, but it can happen. And maybe there are certain changes structurally that do need to be made to bring it more up to date. That's certainly worth looking at.
Well, and is the Constitution where the religion is, or I don't know if, is it religion or it's just like inequality between men and women? Is that the, wouldn't that be say that it was religious, or I don't know, but isn't the problem the inequality between men and women?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that's an issue. I mean, right now there's no codification in the Constitution for equal rights. Now, civil rights laws include women, and there are other types of federal laws that provide that some measure of protection. But if we wanted to codify that in our Constitution, certainly that would be a more powerful way of ensuring that for future generations.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rob. Rob, if you're willing, take a moment or two to sum up what you want us to take away this evening. And I want to thank you very much for giving us your time and your expertise. But what is it that you think we can actually do in terms of an action item? We'll accept that we all become members of Americans United for separation of church and state. We can check that out at au.org. You can go check out their website and figure out how to become a member and support them financially. But how do you want to sum up this evening, Rob?
Okay, I'm going to challenge you a little bit here because this is a free thought organization, correct? I mean, that's in your name,
Correct.
right? And I'm assuming that a lot of folks sitting in here tonight identify with free thought, humanism. And I myself am on the board of the American Humanist Association, so I'm in sympathy with that perspective myself. We are challenged to present free thought, humanism, whatever term you embrace, as a positive vision every day, because there are too many people in this country who believe that that is dangerous or corrosive or bad for society. You know, the American Humanist Association's slogan is good without God. And we must always be working very diligently to help people understand that those of us who have a different perspective on these things, who come at it from a more secular nature, are not a threat to the society. And that means that we have to dispel some myths. And some of that is done by how we live our lives at a very high ethical standard. And I used to joke with people, and I would say, all I'm really asking you to do is have a better ethical system than Christian Nationalists. That is a low bar. You can clear that, believe me. So aside from the obvious stuff like getting involved and joining groups and telling your neighbors why it's important and advocating for secular government and separation of church and state, try as much as you can to be a living example of the importance of secular values in daily life, so that people will come to see that secularism is, in fact, not only not a threat, but a positive good for our society.
Mm-hmm. So for those who might not know, how do you define secular?
Well, to me, secular simply means the absence of religion. It's not hostility toward religion. It's not an attack on religion. It is neutrality. A couple times during my remarks, I mentioned Christian privilege and religious privilege. You can see that it's as close as the coins and the dollars in your wallet. You can see it in our Pledge of Allegiance. You can hear it when politicians talk about God. There's a preferencing, a view among a lot of our leaders and among general society that if you are religious, that is the preferable thing to be. Think about even the national motto, in God we trust. It's not, no God, 5 gods, 20 gods. It's in God we trust. And if you are a real American, you will trust in this God. Well, what does that make the millions of people who don't have a belief in a deity? Somehow second-class citizens? So the reason I'm asking folks to kind of operate at a high ethical standard is to just debunk this idea that if you don't have a belief or you don't embrace the supernatural, that you're not to be trusted, or that you're somehow shifty. We need to be debunking that as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Very good, Rob. I appreciate your time and your wisdom, and your expertise, and thank you very much for spending your time this evening with us. If you're willing to unmute your mics, we can give Rob a round of applause at this point, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob. At this point, I think, unless you have another comment, Rob, I think we can end it here.
Oh, I appreciate you're having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah. And if you want to check out our website, as I said earlier, that's very simple, au.org.
au.org. au.org. And Madeline, are you here?
I am.
Oh, good, Madeline. Always a good day when you're here. So when you're ready, Madeline, you can end this meeting. And thank you everybody for participating and for your good, thoughtful questions and comments. Good night, all.
Have a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
I-